Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this next episode of the Mystery Bible on podcast. I'm very happy to be joined by my good friend, Mr. Dan Rundio, and I think we have a real treat for you this time. We're going to be discussing a book that is near and dear to my heart and that Dan has also read and appreciated. And we're really looking forward to sharing some of the fun and interesting things we've learned. On this podcast, we have fun with strange topics from a biblical perspective. And Dan is more than qualified to offer a fun opinion on that. But most of all, I just enjoy talking with them and look forward to the time with them. So God willing, Zoom and everything else will work out well. This will record well, and we'll actually be able to put it up for people to listen to and enjoy. So we look forward to hearing your thoughts and comments afterwards. And I don't think for most of you, Dan needs any more introduction. Dan and I worked and taught together and have traveled together and have preached together. And we share our thoughts on a nearly daily basis, whether it be memes or ridiculous headlines or profound insights. So hopefully tonight it is more of the latter and fewer of the former. So what I want to introduce is the book that we're going to be discussing tonight is a really neat book. It is called Imagine Heaven, and it is by John Burke, John Burke, who is a pastor and somewhat of a theologian, former engineer turned pastor. And it is on a very interesting subject of near-death experiences. So if you're not familiar with near-death experiences, but you are listening to this podcast, then buckle up. It's another one of those strange topics that will offer all kinds of thought expanding and horizon expanding things, but is really appropriate from a Christian perspective because there's a lot of discussion on heaven and probably a little bit on hell as well. So Dan, to get it started here, if you want to share any opening thoughts about the book Imagine Heaven and how you came across it and what your general impressions were, and we'll get into a little bit more specifics. And there's no formal agenda here. I just want to give people a good sense for this book and this topic and maybe inspire them to do a little bit more of their own thoughtful research.
Yeah, thanks, Joel. I first read this book because you recommended it to me, and that's really the reason I read the book, because I would have been pretty skeptical of a near-death experience book beforehand, and probably would not have bothered reading it. But I trust you.
So
I know
what you're saying is you're like a beta listener of the podcast before there was a podcast.
Right.
Where Joel's like, here's a weird book I read. You should read it. And you're like, okay.
Yeah. I mean,
I don't know. How long ago was that? Was that a year ago, 2 years ago, 6 months ago? I don't recall. I remember really liking this book when I first touched on it.
Yeah, probably 2 years ago.
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah. And so since then, I've recommended it to many other people. And it took me a couple chapters into it to really accept it.
That's kind of par for the course for most of my recommendations, by the way.
But then it blew my mind, right? It's incredibly well done. It's well researched. It gets to a point where there's so much information thrown at you where it really gets pretty hard to deny that he's onto something on this topic.
Can you, before we get into near-death experiences and what they are and why it's an interesting topic, can you just talk a little bit about your skepticism and maybe something of that transition from, okay, what is this, to, oh, wow, this is interesting, to, oh, wow, this is way bigger than I thought. Do you have any description of what it's like to go through that? Because anybody listening here might be going through somewhat of that process for themselves, like near-death experience. What does that even mean? We'll get into what it means, but just that process of going from weirded out to eyebrows raised to blown away.
Yeah. So I guess I started skeptical probably for the most part, from a Christian perspective of, you hear these near-death experiences of people who aren't believers, but still experience seeing Jesus. And that didn't really mesh with what I would have expected to happen. And he does address that in the book. There's actually makes a really good point. Like the Apostle Paul, before he knew Jesus, saw Jesus, and then had to make a decision whether or not he was going to follow Jesus. So just because you have a near-death experience and you see Jesus doesn't mean that you didn't have to be a Christian to get to that point.
We know biblically that Satan saw Jesus
right,
at some point.
right.
So
So
there's a lot of people who see Jesus. I think there's a case to be made that everybody is confronted with Jesus
right,
at some point, for better or for worse.
right. So when I first thought about near-death experience, it was more in like, okay, so these people are going to heaven, and how can you be going to heaven if you don't know Jesus? But the book really does a good job of explaining that's not necessarily just because they're seeing glimpses of heaven doesn't mean that they are ending up in heaven. And
Hmm.
there's a whole lot more mystery, which I mean, a lot of what this podcast is going to be about is how much mystery there is surrounding the Bible and how much bigger God is than we can imagine, and we can't really put him in these boxes.
Hmm. That makes me think of, we often categorize it as a parable where Jesus talked about the rich man and Lazarus, but it doesn't quite fit the same mold as Jesus' other parables because it's the only one where he names the people involved.
Yeah.
And you do have somebody there who is seeing heaven, but also experiencing some form of hell. And heaven and hell are kind of blurry in a way in scripture where we get a sense of them, but there's no real clear explanation of it. And in that story that Jesus tells about the rich man and Lazarus, then you have a rich man who's in hell, but looking into heaven and talking with Jesus. But it doesn't mean that he's redeemed or saved in that case. In fact, he's actually kind of accepting his own condemnation and asking for mercy so that other people don't have to. And it's a really profound vignette that Jesus shares, and it's quite different from his other parables. And I hesitate to even call it a parable because it really doesn't even follow the format of his
Yeah.
parables. And it makes me think of that when we think of heaven and hell and what are they. And many good authors have tried to capture that. I think of C.S. Lewis and The Great Divorce, which is one of my all-time favorite books, and maybe we'll get into it at some point on this podcast. If anybody who hasn't read it, it's fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
So for today's topic, the topic really is near-death experiences, and that is the acronym for that is NDE, and that was classified, I think, in the 70s. Was it Dr. Baker, who I don't remember exactly, I could be wrong. There was a physician who said, hey, there's this strange thing that is happening to people who clinically die and then come back, and they're describing these fantastic things on the other side. So just to be clear, and I want you in just a minute, Dan, if you can kind of describe what your understanding of a near-death experience is and what it's classified as. I'll just say what it's not. A near-death experience is not just narrowly escaping death. That's a misconception a lot of people have where, oh, I almost died. The piano fell on the sidewalk just behind me. I nearly died. That was a near-death experience. Maybe, but when we're talking about near-death experiences, and for the purpose of the book, Imagine Heaven, then it's specifically talking about something a lot more profound and a lot more meaningful. So from the book and from Burke, what's your understanding of what would be classified as a near-death experience?
Yeah, so I think like the term near-death experience is a little confusing because these people are thoroughly dead, right? So I think that's part of where it gets confusing is you call it near death because they died, but then they are alive now. But these people are clinically dead. I mean, some of them, one guy was dead for 10 hours and woke up in the morgue. One lady was drowned and underwater for I think it was like 30 minutes, right? So these people are not near death. They were fully dead and then come back. So they're clinically
to
dead.
jump in there, those are people that are, by all clinical measures, including instruments that measure brain electrical activity, heart activity, they're gone. There's nothing left. And many of these people have been actually clinically declared dead while they're laying on an operating table or next to a crash cart or at the scene of a terrible accident. They're dead by clinical accounts, and then they come back.
Right. Yeah. I mean, their hearts are stopped. There's no more brain waves. But then they say during that time they felt more alive than ever before. And there's a series of different experiences that people have, and they list. And there's been a lot of research into this, right? This isn't just talking to a couple people here and there and sharing their stories. There's been thousands of research articles done. There's been, I think, 55, as of the time this book was written, there had been 55 researchers or teams of researchers that published 65 studies that have gone over like 3,500 near-death experience.
And when you say published, we're talking about peer-reviewed articles in major medical
Right.
publications, like everything from American Medical Association to Journal of American Medicine and psychiatry. And this concept, essentially, since the 70s, has captured certain corners of the medical research universe, and very, very highly qualified people have done clinically controlled studies. And this is part of why this is such a weird topic, because a lot of the topics we talk about on this podcast, there's no medical research on, or if there is, it's very, very hard to verify. But when you start getting people who have only to lose by researching these topics and spending years of their life saying, is there something to this or not? And in many cases, having pretty interesting life-changing stories, of which there are many in this book and other associated books. It's a little bit of a strange topic. And I think that speaks to your initial skepticism, followed by, oh, wait, this is actually a serious thing. But it's one of those things that is not talked about unless somebody asks. So a lot of these
Mm-hmm.
patients, they're in a terrible accident or have a cardiac event or an aneurysm or whatever, something that puts them to the over the border of clinical death. And then usually it's minutes and sometimes hours later they come back and say, something amazing happened to me during that. And it's consistent enough. And I think the statistic I heard was something like 1 out of every 25 or 30 people
You're right.
in the US, and this is a phenomenon that's not specific to the US, it's worldwide, and covers a lot of people, have had some kind of experience. And we'll kind of define a little bit of what categorizes a near-death experience. They're getting all these people who have this experience, and it's common enough and consistent enough and precise enough that it's been able to be measured by professionals, by people who are clinical researchers and who actually make their living looking into these kind of phenomena. And we're not talking for the History Channel, we're talking for medical research publications.
Mm-hmm.
And at this point, to your point, I think in the book, I think it was 2011 or so, there were, at the time of publishing, more than 800 articles in major medical publications just on this topic specifically. And nobody's saying anymore that it doesn't exist. There's some argument about what it is and how it could be explained, but there are a lot of elements of the phenomena that lead people to believe that the big question is there clinically life after death? After physical death, does some element of the human being, whether it's a soul or a spirit, go somewhere while the body lays there on a table or in a morgue or at the scene of an accident or something like that?
Right. And a lot of the book goes into specific stories, and some of those stories are just people that couldn't make this stuff up, right? So he interviews a lot of adults and a lot of people who don't have anything to gain, like a lot of high level professionals. But then there's also people in there, like little children, who saw things and knew things that they could not have possibly known, like where they met a
But give a
sibling.
couple of specific examples if you have a few at hand, just so
Yeah,
people understand how profound this is.
yeah. So one was a kid. This is like maybe a 4 or 5 year old who died and met a sibling that they didn't know they had, and they come back and they're talking to the parents about this sibling, and they're like, "What are you talking about? You don't have a sibling?" And they're like, "Yes, uh, she died in your tummy." And so it was like a miscarriage, and so they were just blown away. And
So,
This kid could not have known.
so to clarify, you're talking about a young child who dies, clinically dies, says that they go and have this experience, and one of the people they meet is a sibling that they didn't know that they had, that their parents were able to verify after the fact,
Right.
indeed had died without this child ever meeting them.
Right. And then there's another child who met a grandfather, and they're going back, and parents are asking him questions about heaven and about the grandfather, and he's answering things that he could not have possibly known. They show him pictures of the grandfather when he was old and he didn't recognize him. And then they find a picture of the grandfather when he was young, like 29. And he's all, oh, yeah, that's him. That's Pop. And so there's, interesting things like that. There's blind people who die and then they can see. And obviously what they're describing it's very difficult to describe because you have somebody who's been blind from birth who can then see for the first time and doesn't necessarily really have the words. Although not having the words is a very common, like, heaven is so much bigger than what we can imagine, which is what the Bible tells us it is, that nobody has the words.
I found it really fascinating that the people who were born blind were an entire clinical subset of study subjects for near-death experiences, because these were people who have no concept of vision, don't dream in vision, they don't see black, there's just no visual concept in their life, and then they die clinically for whatever reason and have a near-death experience where they have these profound visual experiences that are paradigm shifting because they've never seen before. Now they're seeing colors and shapes and seeing scenes from their past that they can visually describe when they come back, but they don't know like what the color orange is because they just know, oh, I saw colors, I don't know what they're called because I've never seen them before.
Right.
Nobody's ever explained them to me before. Or they're seeing a good visual image of their own body as they rise above their body while their body lies on a table. And that's all really fascinating, but there were a few things that you can't clinically describe a child seeing their dead grandfather. But then there were a few categories of experiences that people had that you really can clinically test, which were, for example, one of the ones that comes to mind, and this is a famous case, is a woman who died and left her body, and after having a profound experience was able to describe things in detail that she could not possibly have known. And one of them was, there was a shoe on the third floor window ledge of a hospital. And she had never been to the third floor of this hospital. She came into the hospital unconscious, died on the table, came back and told them about this crazy experience and said, oh, by the way, there's a shoe on the third floor window ledge of this hospital, and described the shoe in detail. The doctor was, so intrigued that he went and found the shoe and it matched exactly what she said. And there's just no way you can make something like that up. There's no way for her. There's no prior explanation for how that could happen. And in this case, if I remember correctly, the doctor was so shaken by the experience that he became a near-death experience researcher, because he just said, look, I'm a scientist. There's no other explanation for this except that she left her body and went and saw something that she could not have seen physically from the room that she was in, especially given that her eyes were closed and her brain was off and her heart wasn't beating.
Right. And there was another story like that where a guy was basically died in the operating room. They had to take his dentures out for some reason. And then when he came back to, they had to go find his dentures. Nobody could find the dentures. He's like, oh, they're in the bottom drawer of the crash cart. This nurse put it in there. And there's no way he could have known that because it happened while he was dead.
So how did he say that he knew it?
Because he saw it happen, because he was floating,
they're usually floating up above the scene, watching everything happening to their body, and he's sitting there watching what's happening. There was one of the major areas of research was around patients who had been resuscitated from cardiac events, and a researcher did hundreds of interviews, and it was something like a 96% accuracy rate for people who had claimed a near-death experience versus an extremely low accuracy rate for people who hadn't. Being able to accurately describe exactly what happened during their resuscitation, which is not something that most people would know. because movies and TV shows don't get it right. And the people who hadn't had a near-death experience weren't very good at guessing what had happened to them during the resuscitation. But the people who had said, no, I was there and I watched it. I just wasn't in my body when it happened.
Right.
So all that's very, very interesting, but that really wasn't the point of why John Burke wrote this book, was it?
Right.
What do you think John Burke, the author, was really trying to do by writing a book called Imagine Heaven?
So I think he's trying to get us to understand how amazing heaven is. And so a lot of those examples go into they try to describe something that they cannot describe. And so, 1 Corinthians 2:9 says, what no eye has seen, nor ear has heard, nor the heart of man imagined, what God has prepared for those who love him. Right. And then you get into these stories and they're describing what they saw in heaven. And you see how literally true that verse is, that people are describing colors that they've never seen before, that people exist in more dimensions than we even understand now, that there's sounds that they've never heard before, that the world they see in heaven is beyond our imagining, and that the verses that talk about this earth being a shadow of what's to come are literally true, right? We don't have the slightest grasp of how incredible heaven's going to be, and person after person talks about how words are not enough to describe what they saw.
What are some of the commonalities of what they describe? Because they don't all describe exactly the same thing, but there are common elements that recur again and again, regardless of age, language, religion, geographic element. And I know Burke goes into great detail, but what are the ones that come to your mind that just seem to recur over and over and over? And is it people, and I know some of this because I'm baiting you because I've read the book. It's not people sitting around on clouds playing harps. That's not what they're seeing. It's something
Right.
much, much more profound.
Yeah. Like light emanating from everything, right? You see in Revelation that there doesn't need to be a sun because God is the light and that God is the life, and so people describe like this, like living colors and living light, and that light just emanates from people and plants and everything. They describe.
So you've got light, you've got color, but it's a lot more than that.
Yeah, they talk about time, right? These people, whether they're dead for a few minutes or hours, time, it's like they're outside of time. They step outside of the limitations that we have in time now, and they can experience reviewing 20 years of their life in detail.
And that's a really important element of the NDE. So most of them, or some significant portion of them, include some kind of life review with some being of light and love who is consistently described as and or associated with Jesus Christ, even by Hindus and Muslims and Jews and people who say, I don't believe in Jesus, but I did meet him while I was dead. And can you talk a little bit about what those Jesus meetings and discussions are like?
Yeah, they are overwhelmed by the love, the unconditional love that they experience from Jesus, and just get a profound sense of how much more he loves them than they could have ever hoped or dreamt, right? And again, like these things that are just beyond people's capability even put into words, is the love, and which how much everything really is about love. And he asks them about loving people well.
Come back to that, because a lot of these people, when they come back from this experience, they're completely different. And in fact, that's one of the defining aspects of a near-death experience, is that somebody is very, very changed afterwards. They have major shifts in their life goals and in their plans and in their priorities. What is the thing, or the things, what are they that Jesus seems so interested in? Because a lot of these people describe having, and I think it's something like 35 or 40% of NDEs have a life review with Jesus, and he's very interested in certain elements of their lives. What is it?
Yeah. Well, this also shouldn't come as a surprise biblically, and the book does a really good job of tying scripture in to all of this. But like the greatest commandment is love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and the second is to love your neighbor as yourself. And that seems to really be something that is pressed upon these people, is how important it is to be loving people and to love people well, and that love really is what it's all about, and that the little things we do really do matter.
I remember a couple of the stories, and some of them were in extensive detail, where somebody would have an encounter with Jesus, and which, by the way, never included any condemnation,
Mm-hmm.
any sense of superiority or guilt. It was this overwhelming love and acceptance by Christ, even by people who really didn't know him before. They're getting to meet him, and he's having this extremely compassionate conversation with them. And one of the things that that stuck with me, that he asked in a couple of different of the stories we heard, is he said, "What do you have to show me from your life?" He'd say, You're standing in a room," and he goes, "Here's your life. Here's every major scene of your life. We're looking at it all simultaneously. And as you said, there's no constraint of time or space or anything else. You're looking at it," and he goes, "What do you have to show me?" And it's not accomplishments um, or awards.
Right.
He's looking so consistently at, how did you show my love to the people I put in your life? And for some of these people, that was really meaningful, but others were really dismayed by that, because they said, "Well, I didn't even know I was supposed to be doing that."
Mm-hmm.
And I remember one particular story where the guy said, "If I had known that there was love like this, I would have shown it better." And Jesus said, "You did know, because I showed it to you with how I lived and how I died.
Yeah.
You know that there's love like this." And then he basically said, go back and show it better. And the guy comes back to life and goes, "I got to live my life differently."
Yeah.
And that's a short summary of the kinds of events that people have, including many, many more profound events.
Yeah.
Is there anything else? I know we're a little constrained on time. Is there anything else that from the book that you think is really important for people to know, whether they read it or don't read it? And I've got a few thoughts to share, but what else do you want to make sure people just have in their minds as they think about what is an NDE? Why would I read a book about near-death experiences? Who is this John Burke guy? What's the point? So what? What does this mean to Christians? Can't I just learn all this from the Bible, etc.?
Yeah. And I would say you can learn all this from the Bible, but we're so used to these passages that I think we kind of miss the power in them. And so this is a book that really just adds a lot of color and helps you see heaven in a new light, and maybe uses some new terms. And it still lines up with the Bible. But like people talking about, one person said, it's like you get to heaven and you don't have 5 senses, you realize you have 50 senses. Or you don't just live in 3 dimensions anymore. It's like you live in multiple more dimensions than you can comprehend. And just the vastness and awesomeness of heaven, that is truly so much more. I think even all of us, I think, sometimes wonder, could heaven be that great? Like, is it going to get a little boring after eternity? Right. And this book, I think, does a really good job of painting a picture that it is so much, vastly, infinitely more than we can even know.
I remember something that helped me really understand that is, we read in Psalm 19, in verse 1 that the heavens declare the glory of God and the skies proclaim the work of his hands. A lot of people have heard that. A lot of people have little plaques of that on their, somewhere hanging in their kitchen or whatever. But what if you had never actually seen an incredible sunset on an island over crashing waves before? What if you had never seen a thunderstorm on the horizon before, and then suddenly you saw it and you came back and were trying to explain, like, this is what that verse is talking about. The heavens declare this incredible glory, and there's this work of his hands that is so big and powerful that I can't describe it. And it's, the NDEs are a little bit like that. They add a dimensionality to these things that we read in scripture, like as you quoted before, no eye has seen or ear has heard or nobody's understood. And it's like Paul is straining at language, at the boundaries of language, to try and get people to understand there is so much more out there. And nobody comes back saying, oh, it was dreamy. They all come back saying it was way more real than everything I've ever lived in my life. The love was more real, the colors more real, the texture was more real. I think one thing that's really important that I learned from this book is our minds are very, very small and often very closed when we read scripture. We have this Sunday school concept of heaven and hell. And by the way, not all near-death experiences are positive. There are some hellish near-death experiences or post-death experiences.
Yeah. And they go into that too.
And they get pretty graphic and horrible in some cases. But one of the big takeaways I had is when God says something is bigger than you can imagine, stop thinking that you can imagine it. Stop thinking that you have it all doctrinally dialed in. Jesus loves his people, and people who die get a chance to see that. And the devil's real and evil's real. And some people who die get a chance to see that. And there is no specific rule just because you have some interpretation of a verse of precisely how that happens, or in what order, or to what extent, or to whom it happens, or why it happens. And the heaven that's described in this book, Imagine Heaven, is deep and multi-layered and extensive. And there's borderlands and inner lands and outer lands and city lands and walls and beings and layers of glory. And none of it is supposed to redefine doctrines. It's supposed to get us to recognize that living for what comes next is so much more important than trying to maximize what we have here on earth.
Yep.
Well, Dan, would you recommend, should people have this on their shelf?
Absolutely. This is one of my highest recommended books.
Yeah, it's a really neat one. I think it can do only good things, even though it will confuse some people a little bit, saying, oh, well, that's not what I heard in Sunday school. Well, so what? This is what people are experiencing, and it's worth looking into and thinking about whether or not people can interpret it correctly. Well, thanks, Dan, for joining us. Look forward to the next conversation, and I really appreciate your insight here, and maybe we'll revisit this book or this topic. There are other books on this topic that are also very good, and we certainly appreciate you coming on today and giving your opinions on this.
Yeah, thank you, Joel.
Well, my dear listeners, I hope you enjoyed that episode and this conversation between myself and my dear friend, Mr. Dan Rundio. What did you think? What do you think about the book Imagine Heaven? Have you read it? Did this pique your interest? Did this make you want to learn more about near-death experiences or rethink some of your thoughts or preconceived notions on heaven? You can contact me through mysterybibleon@gmail.com. I would, of course, be happy to hear your thoughts and your ideas or your responses to anything that we discuss here, as well as ideas or requests for things you would like us to discuss in the future. I would also ask, if you're enjoying this podcast, share it with your friends. There is really no way that I know of to advertise a podcast or to try and get more people to listen to it besides word of mouth. It's the best way. It's the best way to get exposure. So post the podcast on social media, share it with friends, recommend it to people, send them your favorite episodes. That's the sort of thing that will help this podcast be worthwhile and gaining an audience and getting the kind of interaction and spreading the kind of good news and thoughtful biblical perspective on some of the more difficult topics out there. Thank you, friends. I appreciate each and every one of you. I thank God for each and every one of you, and I'm so glad that we have this opportunity to have these conversations. I look forward to the next episode.